Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon sessions of our ELT conference. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Laura Patsko today, who'll be talking about creating more inclusive learning experiences. Before we start, just a shout out again to our wonderful sponsors who've made this all possible: Cambridge Assessment English, Ensley Insurance, Language Cert, Macmillan Education, and Trinity College London. If the worst happens, as I said before, and this session goes down, then just wait a minute or so and then try and come back in. We'll try and get everyone back online. But without further ado, I will leave Laura to say more. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Ewan. Let me share my screen and just check everybody can see it. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. If you can't, Ewan, please come back on and tell me. Otherwise, I'll keep talking. Great. So thanks everybody for coming. I see some names I recognize in the chat. Very nice to see you and nice to meet the rest of you. Well, where to begin? My name's Laura. I've been working for the past 6 months or so now on a project with LearnJam on creating more inclusive learning experiences. And this is a project that's been funded by Innovate UK. And it's all about making learning experiences more inclusive, more accessible, more equitable, and so on. So there are going to be 5 parts to this workshop. We will start by looking at what is ILXD, mystery abbreviation, and why does it matter? I'll run you through 3 key insights that have arisen from this project. And then the critical question, how can we create more inclusive learning experiences? Before finishing with some top tips and resources for inclusive learning design. And if we have time at the end, we'll have some Q&A. And if we don't have time, you've got my email address and you're very welcome to get in touch. And my address is on the last slide. Before I dive into the first part, a few other things that I want to mention. So first of all, the session will be quite interactive. There will be plenty of chances for you to share your ideas and your experience. Secondly, the recording will be made available afterwards, and so will the slides. The recording will be subtitled, and the slides will be available in a PDF and in a more accessible format. Which relates to my next point, which is that, like many of us, I'm currently working at home. If you have been in lots of sessions today, or if you have interruptions during the session, don't worry if you need to close your eyes for a moment. Remember, the recording and the slides will be available later. So if you need to step away for any reason, don't worry, don't feel guilty, do what you need to do. And also related to that point, as I'm working from home, we're also potentially limited or affected by my Wi-Fi, my environment, and so on. Hopefully it will all go smoothly, but if, for example, my doorbell rings, you might meet my dog. And if that happens, I'll just ask you to be patient while I calm him down and just reflect on what we've talked about so far. Maybe think about a question you'd like to ask at the end. And yes, please just be patient. And I thank you in advance for your understanding. Hopefully we won't need it. And finally, just a reminder that I'm also learning. This presentation represents just the surface of an iceberg of knowledge, learning, insights, and so on that has been kind of gathering over the past 6 months on this project. And there's still plenty of things that I'm kind of new, that are new to me and that I'm new at doing. So I really welcome your feedback. If there's anything you think could be more clearly explained or presented differently, and particularly made more inclusive or accessible, please send me your feedback. I'd be very happy to hear it and to continue learning. So our first session, what is ILXD and why does it matter? Well, before we get there, I'd actually like you to just share some thoughts. These are thoughts about inclusion. So I'd like you to go to menti.com and enter this code. If you're on a computer, I hope that will be fairly straightforward. If you're on a mobile and you'd prefer, you can use a QR code, excuse me, this QR code, scan this with your mobile phone camera and it will bring up the survey. And I will try to share the live results now as well on my screen. So go to menti.com, enter that code 80779653 and answer the question that arises. See, you should be able to see results appearing live. So have you ever felt excluded from something that you wanted to participate in for reasons that you couldn't change or couldn't avoid? Okay, so quite a few people saying yes, a couple saying I don't know. Interestingly, nobody saying no yet. And we're going to see this as we come to the first part of the presentation and talk about what is ILXD and why does it matter. Hopefully, just by answering this question, you'll be understanding already why it matters, why this is such an important topic. Okay, lots of people saying yes, and a few I don't knows. If you've answered I don't know, I'd be very interested to hear some more thoughts. So please feel free to add any extra comments in the chat box if you want to elaborate on your answer. I'll leave the poll open, but we'll go back to the main presentation for now. So if you've opened the poll in a new tab, please come back into Zoom to watch the presentation. So some background, what is ILXD and why does it matter? Well, the I, you might have guessed, stands for inclusive. And definitions vary quite widely of what inclusion means. Depending on who you ask, they'll say something different. But definitions of exclusion all have one main thing in common. It's about being left out. And as we've just seen from our very scientific survey of the poll of attendees here, it's a very common experience. Most of us have some experience of being left out of some kind of experience, not necessarily a learning experience, but unfortunately, most of us in our lifetime will feel excluded. Now, what we found over the past sort of year or so with COVID-19 is that the trend towards learning online has really been accelerated. There's some debate over the nature of this online learning and nature of online teaching, and it may be more accurate to call it emergency remote teaching or emergency remote learning rather than online learning. But one thing is for sure, and that is that a number of issues with inequality and exclusion have really been exacerbated by this trend. Moving everybody online really fast has drawn attention to gaps of inequality that already existed, but certainly are much more obvious now, I think, to a lot of people and have been, widely discussed. So we know, and I can tell you working with LearnJam, who specialize in digital learning experiences, that with ample time and resources and training, online learning can be really excellent. But of course, the question is, did everybody actually have these things in 2020? And even in 2021, we're now a third of the way into the year. And I don't know about you, but I've found that time is running very quickly. So all of a sudden, we realize we've been doing this for maybe a year. And that doesn't mean that we have now all the funding and all the resource and all the time that we really need to do it as well as we'd like to do it. So this has really been the focus of this project. And our intention, hopefully, is not just to build back better, which is a phrase that's been heard a lot, but to build back fairer. And I think the most important thing to remember at this point going into this project is that for those who routinely experience discrimination or marginalization, inequality is not news. It's not new. It's nothing new. It's not a headline. But for others, 2020 was a real wake-up call, and now is the time to harness that attention. People are paying attention and listening, so we need to be talking about this. And our feeling in this project is that the responsibility for meaningful change to make learning more exclusive lies with gatekeepers like us. So teachers, institutions, educators, publishers, learning providers, all those who uphold systems that we are increasingly aware are unfair in their design. So the whole project has been based around this, and it's been going for several months. There's been a lot of research, a lot of development of different tools, and we're going to talk in this session at what that means in practice and what we've learned and share some of our insights. So ILXD stands for inclusive learning experience design. So you may know the term LXD as learning experience design. This is about making it more inclusive. And we would say now, as we come to the end of this project, that we consider a learning experience to be inclusive if it's truly informed by learners' unique backgrounds and needs. And that means aiming for every learner to be able to participate fully and also being ready to meet new needs when they arise, because our work is never done in being inclusive. A lot of this is based on people's circumstances and states of mind and what's happening in their life, and those things shift and change. So it's not just about ticking some boxes and rolling out a learning experience. It's about being dynamic and dialogic in our approach. So I'd like to share just 3 key insights about ILXD that have emerged from this project. And the first is about terminology. So this word equality, it doesn't mean sameness. And there's a distinction to be made between equality and equity. So what we're talking about here is not ignoring differences between learners, but embracing them. Now, I'm going to show an image that illustrates this probably better than I can describe. So let me show you what equality looks like by analogy. So here in this image on the left, we have 3 people who are trying to see over a wall, and they get equal treatment. So each person gets a box to stand on. But that isn't actually what each person needs. They might be getting the same thing, but their individual differences mean that equal treatment isn't really sufficient for solving the problem that some of them are having. So we can take this a step further and say, well, let's give them treatment that is fair and inclusive, so each person gets the support that they need in order to overcome this problem. So here we have the same 3 people trying to see over the same wall, and they have different support to enable them to do that according to their different needs. So far, so good. Very nice, fair and inclusive, but we could even also go one step further and say, well, why are they trying to see over a wall anyway? Can't we just remove the wall? Can't we just remove the barrier in the system that they're all facing? So in this third picture, you can see that the wall's been removed and replaced with something that achieves the same function, but has a different effect for the people involved. And so this is what we're talking about. We're talking about, in the middle picture, equity, and in the final picture, a kind of ideal world where barriers within the system that exist are removed entirely or replaced with something that does not pose a barrier. So showing this is just intended to illustrate that this is how we can embrace the difference between learners. I think a lot of us have very good intentions, and we may believe that we're achieving a kind of greater equality by saying, well, differences don't matter. I treat all my students the same. But that's not actually necessarily helpful for the challenges that they're facing. It doesn't necessarily solve their problems if they all get the same treatment. So a better question to ask might be, well, does my approach allow every learner to participate fully because that approach is informed by learners' different backgrounds and different circumstances? So this is what I mean about being informed versus ignoring. And that's the first key insight that I want to share. The second is a design principle, which is often expressed as design for one, extend to many. Now, this is not new to the world of design. Anybody here with a background in product design or service design, for example, might have come across this already. But in learning design, it's, again, not new, but novel. For some people, it's unfamiliar. And here's a very famous example. So closed captioning or subtitling of television broadcasts originally intended for people with hearing loss to be able to access televised programming. If they couldn't hear the audio, they could read the words. But of course, this has a kind of side effect, an additional benefit for people who don't have hearing loss, but maybe they're in a loud environment and they can't hear what's on the television. Or equally for language learners, I know a lot of us recommend to learners, when you watch something, put the subtitles on so you can hear and read at the same time. So you're designing for one population, but you're extending the benefits to many populations. Let me show you another example. Here's a photograph I took recently of a dropped curb. So a familiar feature of many towns and cities around the world, originally intended for wheelchair users to be able to navigate the physical environment more easily. But of course, an unintended consequence is it's easier for people pushing a child in a pushchair or somebody pulling a suitcase, for example. So this idea of unintended benefits is quite important to remember when we're designing inclusively, because we often capture the needs of a much wider population than we'd originally intended. And I think the main reason this is so important for learning design is that in addition to those learners who know they have particular access needs, there are many learners who could have undiagnosed disabilities or learning difficulties which affect their ability to access learning content. So we can't just wait for somebody to say, help, I need this or I need that. We can proactively design, we can anticipate needs rather than only respond to them, and design learning content that is already accessible to a wide audience, which will inevitably capture the needs of some other learners who may not have even known to ask for that support. Okay, and then my third insight that I want to share with you is a quotation, which I'll show you in a moment. This quotation is from a person working as a university professor. He uses a wheelchair, and he's been teaching online since about a year ago, since spring 2020. And we talked to a lot of people as part of this project about their experiences of learning and teaching and being included or excluded, to find out more about, to know what we didn't know, to reveal gaps in our own awareness so that we could develop our approach to be more inclusive. And one of the things that this professor said that really stuck with us was this. He said, I don't feel as disabled as I normally do. And the reason I mention this in this talk as a key insight is because there are a lot of dangers in making assumptions. Even if we think that we're being fair and inclusive and empathetic, the risk of assuming that somebody will have a negative experience because of some aspect of their identity could in itself be quite an exclusive approach, because we're still making assumptions about their needs. We still might be making decisions on their behalf. And so really, for this person, what he was expressing, what he was illustrating, was that ordinarily in his work, he has some difficulty navigating to and around the university campus because it's not well designed for somebody using a wheelchair. And at the moment, a lot of his students who started their course some months after going online, or some months after the university went online, they don't even know he uses a wheelchair. And he sort of laughed and said, it's funny, I don't feel as disabled. And it's easy to laugh if we think people are missing something visually obvious. But the point he was making was a very serious one, which is it's not fair for him if we assume his needs. He's the best person to tell us what he needs and what he doesn't need and what supports him and what's problematic and so on. So the risk is about assumptions here. We mustn't assume that exclusion will occur simply because somebody falls into a particular group or has a particular aspect of their identity which we might associate with exclusion. So really our project, when we were doing this, these interviews, was highlighting the importance of including a range of voices in every project, in every learning experience that we design. So not making assumptions about people's needs and experiences, but actually asking individual learners themselves who are best placed to say what they need. And so for me, this kind of suggests that as well as improving our educational practices to be more inclusive, we'd also do well to generate a more inclusive mindset generally among in our institutions and among the communities that we belong to, so that people feel welcome and able to discuss their support needs as they arise or as they change. Now, that's a lot of information to throw at you very quickly. And again, I'd like to hear your experience. So I'm going to give you another poll. It's the same poll as before. So if you still have it open, you can stay on that page and I will move to the next question in just a moment. If you closed it, please go again to menti.com, enter this code, or use your mobile device to scan this QR code. And if you have extra comments, please add them in the chat box. Okay, let me advance the slide for you now. Okay, you should be able to answer this question now then. So is your everyday work informed by learner differences? And you should be able to see the results arriving in real time. Okay, 5 people have voted, thank you. So a majority saying either no or yes sometimes. Particularly if you've answered yes sometimes, I would love to hear more if you want to add your comments in the chat box. What is it that allows you or prevents you from having your work more consistently, let's say, informed by learner differences? Okay, nothing in the chat just yet, but I would love to see your thoughts. And I want to, and I don't know, thank you for being honest. We have an I don't know. There is a 5th option. I wonder if anybody's going to enter. I'll give you just a moment. So there are 40 participants in the session and 18 have voted. So if you're able to, please add your votes now. I should say as well, the question is phrased as it is with everyday work, because I know there will be a range of people in this session. So not all of us are actively teaching at the moment. Some of us might be training or managing a school, but for each of us, whatever role we hold, if we're engaging with learners at any point, our work could be informed by differences between those learners' needs and circumstances. So it could be a case of managing their timetable with them, for example, or the deadlines for their assignments. Or it could also be a case of working with them on what materials are available to them, how they can manage their home environment, and so on. Somebody very honestly in the chat says, I try to be consistent in being aware of my learners' differences, but sometimes I forget. That's very honest. And I think true for a lot of us. We're managing a lot of things at the moment. And when we have many classes and many students, it's hard to always be on top of things. Someone else mentions, I find it hard when students refuse to turn their cameras on to find out enough about them. It creates a barrier. Yeah, I've heard this a lot. There's been a lot of debate this past year about cameras on, cameras off, and the reasons for and against. And it's a really tricky one because, of course, we don't always know why somebody isn't putting their camera on. It could be a technological issue. Maybe they don't know how, or maybe the tech doesn't allow it. Could be a very personal issue. Maybe they don't want to share their home environment, their private environment. Same goes for a lot of teachers. Could be a disciplinary issue if you're with young learners and maybe they're in their pajamas and they know they shouldn't be. So there's a lot of reasons. And this goes back to what I was saying about creating a mindset and a community of openness where people feel able, when they're ready, to share their needs and discuss that with their teachers or their managers or whoever, so they can find a solution that works for everybody and it doesn't become a binary of included, excluded. Someone else mentions the lack of social space when teaching online can make it more difficult to identify important learner needs and differences. Right, so the kind of informal milling around outside the classroom, for example, and chatting to learners and getting to know them as people, rather than sort of a learner in a chair, is often missing online. Absolutely, and I've seen different solutions to this problem in the past year. So some institutions I know are leaving their lesson links open either 10 minutes before or 10 minutes after class to allow for learners and teachers to mix a bit more like they would have done in a face-to-face environment. And I've also seen some institutions making more use of tutorial time, so scheduled one-to-one meetings or kind of office hours, like an open door, where a student can come for just a couple of minutes and chat and have a progress check with their teacher and talk about anything else that might be bothering them, or equally talk about anything that's working really well for them that they want to continue doing. Okay, thank you to everyone who voted. I'm going to close the poll now. And we'll go back to our presentation. So how are we doing for time? Make that about 18 minutes left. Excellent. So the big question, how can we create more inclusive learning experiences? So I would say there are three main points, at least in the work that I've been doing with LearnJam, where we are designing learning experiences. There are three main points where we can think about how inclusive these are. And they follow a kind of before, during, and after structure. So on the left here in the pink circle, we could say during the development of a learning experience. So while we're designing it, while we're researching it, while we're testing it and prototyping it and building it, at every point, we can be looking at different aspects of that learning experience to evaluate how inclusive it is or will be. Then, of course, the middle yellow circle, there's during a live learning experience. So this could be a course that's already running, or a material such as a course book or an app that's already published. It's never too late to try and include somebody, and we can be monitoring as we go how people are using or engaging with that learning experience, and if there's anything we can do to make it more inclusive now rather than later, which is our third circle, the blue circle. So when we're evaluating something that already exists and it's too late now to change that experience, maybe it's a course that's finished, or it's a book that's been published and it won't be reviewed, it won't have a second edition. So we can reflect on how we did and think about how we can do better next time. Okay, so not rocket science. That's the easy part, the kind of before, during, and after. The hard part is, where do we begin? You know, what questions do we ask? What are we considering when we're trying to make things more inclusive? So this is one of the big questions we've been trying to answer with this project. And we've created a sort of framework to help think about this complex space and help navigate it. So we would say that there are four broad factors that can affect the inclusiveness of a learning experience, and that each factor can have an influence at different levels. So from the very specific kind of micro level to a more macro level to a very meta level that transcends many things, not just learning. And these are the four dimensions that we've identified. So the four broad factors. There's the kind of the who, the where, the what, and the how. So there's the learner themselves. You know, what is it that they bring to a learning experience? What is it about them that influences the experience? Then there's their environment, and this could be interpreted in both physical and digital terms. So things like, where are they studying? Do they have a quiet space? Do they have the technology they need to access a certain platform, for example? Then there's the what, so the learning itself, the material or the content or the task. What are they learning? What's in the syllabus? How is it assessed? What's the test? And then there's what we're calling interactions. So how does the learner interact with that content? What are the methods used? What are the modes used? Is it digital? Is it face-to-face, online, offline? Does it require certain functionality in their phone? What are the task types used, and so on and so forth? And at different levels, these can have an effect on how inclusive that learning experience is. So I said before, you've got the very kind of micro, very specific level. So very specific to that learning experience. What is it that is built into the learning experience itself? Or what do learners themselves bring to that experience? Then at a slightly higher level, maybe a bit more abstract, you have, here we go, my slide is advancing strangely. At the slightly higher level, you have this bigger picture. So what is it that's not built into the experience itself, but it's still required in order for learners to be able to participate fully? So I'm thinking of things here like an internet connection. For this webinar, for example, I could say it's not that the webinar contains the internet or that I have somehow packed the internet into the webinar, but without the internet, you can't access the webinar. So it's not built in, but for you to be able to participate fully, you still need that thing, and that would be part of your digital environment. And then at a much higher level, kind of meta, something that transcends many things, not just learning, you have this kind of outside in. So what are there, what factors are there that may not even seem related to learning, but will almost certainly affect the learner's experience? So if I think, for example, of the learner themselves, imagine the learner has recently experienced a loss, and their process of grief and bereavement is making it really difficult for them to do everyday things that they were doing only a week ago or a month ago. We could say that's not about the learning experience, but it's absolutely going to affect how the learner feels and how well they can engage with an experience, and whether they're sleeping well and you know, feeling good in themselves and able to kind of motivate themselves to learn, for example. Or similarly, if we think about the interactions dimension, think about how the learner interacts with an experience through a mobile device, for example. If that learning experience requires them to swipe or click or tap or do something that's actually a function of the phone, well, the person designing the phone wasn't designing it for that learning experience. It's not really limited to learning, but without that functionality, it could affect their learning experience. If they don't have it, they might not be able to access the experience. There's a risk of exclusion. So really, this is a way of conceptualizing a very complex space and identifying barriers that could arise for some learners, with a view to eliminating those barriers or mitigating them. And we're going to come back to that question in just a moment. So this allows us to ask questions when we're designing, like, for example, is the content accessible to a range of learners with different abilities? Or if a learner's physical study environment isn't ideal, how can we support them? Or does the learner see their own lived experience in the learning content? So, for example, do the materials represent learners from a certain background? Do they see characters in the material with identities like theirs? Or have we allowed for individual learner choice or preference in the way that they engage with the content? For example, can they change the font or the colors on a digital platform? Can they download material to look at offline? Do they have any choice over the way that they interact with the learning experience? So these are just some examples of the kinds of questions we might ask. Now, in terms of questions, I'm going to ask you a few more questions now, and I'll ask you to use the chat box again. And the first is a question that's come up quite often when we've been talking about this approach with teachers is, well, how is this different from needs analysis, right? We always do a needs analysis. So one element of ILXD is a focus on the individual. You saw that in the first dimension. And I'd like to ask you for your opinions. So how do you feel that this is different to a standard needs analysis process that many teachers go through? So I'll ask you to share any thoughts in the chat before I give you my own thoughts on the subject. I will also say that this being English UK, many of us are coming from an English language teaching background, but if you have experience from teaching other subjects, that would also be quite interesting to hear. So a couple of people are saying not focused exclusively on language learning needs. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. You took the words out of my mouth. Not just about language academic or professional needs. Yes, certainly. So where we might say to a student, well, why are you taking this course? What are you studying? What's your goal? This is much broader than that. Yes, definitely. More inclusive of the whole person rather than language learning needs. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So yeah, you're reading my mind here. The important thing here is that we're talking about how to include the whole person. Of course, that includes things like, why are you learning the language, or what's your professional goal that this will help you achieve? But it could also take into account access issues, things like how much time have you got to study? How can I help you manage that? Is there any equipment that you require and you don't have? It could include things like scheduling flexibility, additional support needs, or the need to access material in different formats, and so on. Hugh, and I see your message saying there's a raised hand. Yes, absolutely. If we have a raised hand, I can address that question. Go ahead.
Okay, Nilafar, if you're able to talk. What's your question, please?
I can hear some background noise, but I don't hear a question. Okay, I'll tell you what, if you are able to ask your question in the chat, I'd be happy
I'll
to
put it in the
address
chat. Yeah, obviously they couldn't
great.
speak. It was nice to try, but
it's always worth a try. It's always worth a try. Okay, so my next question for you is to focus on the physical environment. So in your experience, or in your opinion, how can the learner's physical environment affect their experience of learning? And I'm not limiting this to online learning. So you could be imagining someone studying online from home. You could be imagining somebody in a school. You could imagine something different altogether. But in your experience and opinion, how can the learner's physical environment affect their experience of learning? Profoundly, yes, their ability to listen, concentrate, speak. Yes, and what is it about their physical environment that could impact those abilities? Thank you for that comment. It can distract the students. Yes, absolutely. I warned you, for example, if my doorbell goes, then my dog might make an appearance. So things like that. Family distractions, yes, weather, roadworks, uncomfortable chairs, absolutely. Yeah. And somebody makes the point it can be positive or negative, and I think that's really important. I've kind of implied here that it's a negative effect, but there could also be positive effects on their environment as well, such as having a calm and quiet environment. Or some people don't work well in a quiet environment. They need background music, for example, to study. Okay, super. We will skip this and go straight to our last question. So what do we do about the parts of an online learning experience that we can't control, or that we have less control over? So I invite you to share your experience or your practical ideas in the chat box. What can we do about the parts of an online learning experience that we can't control? There will always be some things that are outside our control as teachers. So what can we do? think there's a slight time delay on me seeing the chat, so forgive my silence for a moment. Offer asynchronous options for learning. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So one thing that we can do if we can't control their access to synchronous learning is we can offer options in an asynchronous way as well. So not everything has to be done live. It can also be done later, offline, and so on. Consider them at planning stage. Yes, absolutely. So when we're planning our lessons, actually take a moment to reflect. What can we do to help them? And yes, thank you. Another comment in the chat here. So helping students identify solutions within their control. Yeah, and I would combine that with at the planning stage. So thinking ahead, this student might have difficulty with X. How can I prepare the lesson in a way that will help them engage with that difficulty and find a solution for themselves? I'll let your comments keep coming through. It's time for me to summarize. My general advice would be that if we think of inclusion as a combination of factors at different levels, then what we can do about the elements that we can't control is focus on the ones that we can and try to balance, try to offset. So for example, if I'm aware that a learner does not have long interrupted periods in which they can study, I can't suddenly give them a quiet space and a better environment, but I can potentially change the assignment deadlines I give them so they have some flexibility, like try and submit something on this date, but if it comes a day later, that's okay. So it gives them a little bit of time if their environment is not quite right and they need an extra night or something like that to fit in the work. So I don't have control over their environment, but I do have control over the assignment, and that's how I can help them manage potentially. Okay, I'm going to give you some top tips and some resources to finish off with. And I'd encourage you to take a screenshot if you're very impatient and want to go and look at these resources straight away. Otherwise, you can wait for the slides to be made available after the webinar. So my top tips would be to remember to consider the whole learner. Do have empathy, but remember that action is an essential next step. So we often get caught in the kind of learning phase of inclusion, and we don't translate that into action. So it's really important to learn and to listen, but also then to do something about it. One of the things that we can do is build in flexibility and adaptability in our learning experience design. And one way to do that is to encourage choice and to encourage direct input from learners. So co-creating content and co-creating experiences is a really valuable way of including a range of voices. My last two top tips are just to remember that everyone benefits from more inclusive practices. This is, again, that principle of designing for one, but extending to many. We often have unintended consequences and benefits for other groups when we try to be more inclusive in our approach. And finally, to look at the whole system and not just its parts. So not just thinking about the task or the mobile app or something like that, but thinking about how all of these things relate to each other. These are the links I mentioned. I'd recommend you do some further reading. It's a really interesting field of research, and I just wish I had more time to go into it with you. I'm afraid there isn't time for more Q&A than the things you've already mentioned in the chat, but I will give you my email address on my last slide. You're welcome to get in touch if you have more questions. I'd love to keep in touch on this topic. There's always so much more to be said. Thank you, Hugh, and I can see you've returned.
Yeah, they sort of return like the
just popped
kind
up on my screen.
Angel of Doom or something to kind of say that the session is now ending. But yeah, so thanks very much. That was really insightful and lots of good practical tips as to how to make learning more inclusive, which is great. Next session's due to start very shortly, so we'll end this one here. Thank you to Laura and to everyone else who's contributed to a great conference so far. Thank you.
Thank you all too. Thanks to all the participants, and thanks, Hugh, for hosting. Bye, everyone.